3 hours after my mother's funeral, my stepmother carried my mother's chair out of the kitchen and told the movers to put it with the donation pile. I was still wearing the black wool dress I'd stood in all day at the cemetery when she looked at me and said, "Claire, honey, we can't keep turning this house into a shrine." Then she opened a bottle of white wine using the same countertop my mother used to knead bread every Sunday morning. I remember staring at her hand on the corkscrew because my mother's coffee mug was still sitting beside the sink with lipstick on the rim. "Vanessa," I said quietly, "Mom's things are still here." She gave me this thin little smile. "Exactly, that's the problem." My father didn't say a word. He sat at the dining table in his gray sweater staring into a glass of whiskey. Ethan walked through the kitchen grabbing leftover sandwiches from the funeral trays like this was just another Saturday. "Are we seriously doing this tonight?" I asked. Vanessa leaned against the counter and crossed her arms. "Your mother left nearly $800,000 behind, Claire. We need to discuss what happens next." The room went completely still. Even the refrigerator hum suddenly sounded too loud. My chest tightened so hard I thought I might actually stop breathing, because my mother had been buried less than 4 hours earlier. Before I continue, if this story speaks to your heart, or if you've ever felt invisible inside your own family, please take a moment to like and subscribe only if this story truly resonates with you. And I genuinely love to know where you're watching from tonight, your city or country, and what your local time is right now. Sometimes it helps to remember we're not alone while listening to stories like this. My name is Claire Whitmore. I'm 32 years old, and the night my mother's chair disappeared from our kitchen was the night I realized grief can make people reveal who they really are. Everything started 6 days earlier, right after my mother died. The hospital room still smelled faintly like antiseptic and vanilla lotion when Vanessa stepped outside to take an important call less than 10 minutes after the doctor left. I remember hearing her voice through the hallway window, calm, organized, almost cheerful. "Yes, I'll need access to all estate records immediately," she said, "and I want the locks changed before the weekend." At the time, I told myself I misunderstood. People handle grief differently. That's what I kept repeating in my head while helping sign discharge paperwork for someone who wasn't coming home anymore. My mother, Eleanor Whitmore, had spent 27 years building a small design business from the back room of our house. She wasn't flashy. She didn't own yachts or vacation homes in Aspen. But she worked harder than anyone I've ever known. She paid for my college tuition in monthly installments because she hated debt. She packed my lunches until I was 16 because she said homemade food made bad days easier. And every Christmas morning, she played Ella Fitzgerald records while cinnamon rolls baked in the oven. That was my mother. Quiet things, steady things. The kind of woman people underestimated because she never needed attention to prove her worth. Vanessa was the opposite. She married my father 4 years after my parents divorced. Everything about her felt polished. Her hair always looked professionally blown out. Her voice had this soft, practiced warmth that disappeared the second nobody important was listening. At the funeral, she cried beautifully. That's the only way I know how to describe it. Controlled tears, elegant pauses. One hand pressed against her chest while relatives hugged her and whispered how strong she was being. But the moment the guests started leaving, she transformed into someone colder. "Claire, could you go through your mother's closet tomorrow?" she asked while folding napkins in the kitchen. "There's no reason to keep all those old things sitting around." I looked at her. Her body isn't even buried yet. She didn't flinch. Exactly why we should stay productive. My father kept wiping condensation from his whiskey glass without looking up. That scared me more than Vanessa did, because my father used to defend my mother over everything. When I was little, he once drove across 3 counties during a snowstorm because my mother mentioned craving strawberry ice cream. Now he couldn't even tell his wife to stop boxing up Eleanor's sweaters. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of packing tape ripping downstairs. Sharp, repetitive. I walked into my mother's art studio and stopped breathing for a second. Half the shelves were empty. Her sketchbooks were stacked inside cardboard boxes labeled "Donate." Her reading glasses were gone from the desk, and the lavender candle she always burned while working had disappeared too, leaving only the faint smell of bleach in the room. Vanessa stood near the window directing movers. "Careful with those," she said. "Most of it's probably junk, but some pieces might still sell online." I stared at her. "Those are my mother's personal journals." She tilted her head slightly. "Claire, sweetheart, keeping every little thing isn't healthy." Then she lowered her voice. "And honestly, you don't need all that inheritance money alone anyway. Something inside me shifted right then, not loudly, not dramatically, just a small cold crack somewhere deep in my chest, because that was the first moment I realized this wasn't about grief. It wasn't about healing. It wasn't even about family. Vanessa already had a plan, and judging by the way my father refused to meet my eyes, I had the terrible feeling he already knew exactly what it was. The strange thing about unfair families is that the imbalance usually starts so quietly nobody notices it happening. It happens in tiny moments, tiny sentences, tiny choices that slowly teach one person they matter less than everyone else in the room. When I was 11, my mother spent 3 straight nights sewing my winter concert dress because we could not afford the one the school recommended. I still remember sitting at the kitchen counter while she pinned navy fabric under the yellow overhead light. The radio played Frank Sinatra softly in the background while snow tapped against the windows. Around midnight, my father walked in wearing his work jacket and loosened tie. He kissed my mother on the forehead and said, "Ellie, you do not have to stay up all night for this." My mother smiled without looking up from the sewing machine. "I know," she said. "I want to." That was who she was. Love looked like work to her. Quiet work nobody applauded. Years later, after the divorce, Vanessa entered our lives like someone stepping onto a stage halfway through a performance and immediately demanding the spotlight. I was 24 the first time she came to dinner at our house. She arrived carrying an expensive bakery cake and wearing cream-colored heels that clicked sharply across the hardwood floors my mother had refinished herself years earlier. "This place has potential," Vanessa said while looking around the kitchen. "Not beautiful. Not warm. Potential." My mother just smiled politely and asked if she wanted coffee. Vanessa glanced at the old cabinets and laughed softly. "Maybe after Richard updates this kitchen." I still remember the way my mother's fingers tightened slightly around the coffee pot before she answered. "Actually, I designed most of it myself." Vanessa blinked, like she had not expected my mother to answer back at all. My father laughed awkwardly and changed the subject. That became his specialty after the divorce. Avoidance, silence, pretending tension was not happening right in front of him. At first, I convinced myself Vanessa was just overly polished. Some people are. But over time, the comments became sharper, smaller, more personal. "Claire always was sensitive," Vanessa would say if I disagreed with something. Or, "Your mother fills your head with too much emotion." Once, during Thanksgiving dinner 2 years ago, she looked directly at my mother and said, "You are lucky Richard handled finances all those years. Creative people are usually terrible with money." My mother smiled calmly and kept slicing turkey. But later that night, while helping her wash dishes, I saw her standing silently at the sink, staring out the dark kitchen window. "Mom?" I asked softly. She dried her hands slowly with a towel. "Some people mistake kindness for weakness," she said. "Do not ever make that mistake yourself." At the time, I thought she was talking about Vanessa. Now I realize she was warning me about something much bigger. After my father married Vanessa, everything in the family shifted around her preferences. Christmas dinners moved to restaurants she liked. Family vacations changed. Traditions disappeared one by one. The old handmade ornaments my mother painted when I was little stopped appearing on the tree because Vanessa said they looked dated. Even the photo wall in the hallway changed. Pictures of my mother slowly vanished over the years until only one remained, tucked beside the laundry room door where nobody really looked anymore. I noticed these things because my mother noticed them too, but she never complained. Not once. Instead, she poured herself deeper into work. Eleanor Whitmore Designs grew quietly during those years. She started taking commercial clients, boutique hotels, restaurant interiors, local galleries. I used to stop by her studio after work and find her surrounded by fabric samples and blueprints, with reading glasses sliding down her nose. "You should slow down," I told her once while bringing takeout containers into the studio. "You are working 70 hours a week." She smiled tiredly. "I like building things nobody can take away from me." Back then I thought she meant independence after the divorce. Now I know she meant security, protection, preparation. 3 months before she died, my mother invited me over on a rainy Thursday night. She made grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup even though I was 32 years old because she said comfort food works at every age. The storm outside rattled the windows while she organized papers at the dining table. I remember asking, "Why are you suddenly sorting everything?" She looked down at the folders for a second too long before answering. "Just cleaning things up." Then she slid one sealed envelope into a drawer beside her chair. "If anything ever feels wrong after I am gone," she said carefully, "pay attention to who starts rushing you." I laughed nervously. "Mom, you are not going anywhere." She smiled then, softly, sadly. "Everybody goes somewhere eventually, Claire." At the time, I thought it was grief talking because her diagnosis had already started exhausting her. But standing in her half-empty studio now, watching movers carry away pieces of her life, while Vanessa supervised from the doorway with perfectly manicured hands folded across her coat, I suddenly remembered every strange sentence my mother had said over the past year. Every pause, every warning, every careful look she gave me when Vanessa entered the room. And when I opened one of the donation boxes later that night, I found something underneath my mother's sweaters that made my stomach drop completely. I pulled the sweater out carefully because it was one of my mother's favorites. Soft gray cashmere with tiny paint stains near the cuffs from years of working in her studio. Something rectangular slipped from the folds and hit the hardwood floor with a sharp little sound that made me jump. At first I thought it was an old receipt, but when I bent down, I realized it was a business card. Thick cream-colored cardstock. Daniel Mercer, estate attorney. There was handwriting on the back in my mother's neat blue ink. "If Vanessa pushes too fast, call him." I stared at the sentence so long my vision blurred slightly. The house around me sounded distant suddenly. Muffled footsteps downstairs, cabinet doors closing. Vanessa laughing softly at something Ethan said. My hands actually started shaking. Because my mother was not dramatic. She did not leave mysterious warnings unless she had a reason. I slid the card into my coat pocket just as Vanessa's voice floated upstairs. "Claire, we are ordering dinner. Are you coming down?" Her tone sounded sweet enough for strangers to believe it. I swallowed hard and shoved the box closed before answering, "In a minute." That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept hearing my mother's voice from that rainy Thursday dinner. "Pay attention to who starts rushing you." Around 6 in the morning, I finally got up and drove to my apartment downtown. I needed space away from that house. Away from Vanessa's perfume drifting through hallways that used to smell like my mother's lavender candles and coffee. The city streets were wet from overnight rain. Chicago looked gray and exhausted under the winter clouds. I stopped at a red light near Wabash Avenue and realized I was gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers hurt. By the time I reached my apartment building, my phone already showed 3 missed calls from Vanessa. 1 voicemail. "Claire, honey, we really need to discuss the estate timeline today. Certain legal matters cannot wait forever." I did not call back. Instead, I made coffee and sat at my kitchen island, staring at the business card while sunlight slowly crept across the counter. Daniel Mercer. I almost called immediately, but something stopped me. Fear, maybe. Or the strange feeling that once I made that call, whatever illusion remained about my family would finally disappear for good. Around noon, my best friend Melanie showed up carrying bagels and orange juice because she knows grief makes me forget to eat. The second she walked inside, she looked at my face and said, "Okay, something happened." I handed her the business card without speaking. She read the handwriting twice. "Claire," she said carefully, "your mother knew something." I sat down slowly. Vanessa started talking about the inheritance before the funeral flowers were even gone. Melanie's expression hardened immediately. "That is disgusting." I laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "The scary part is my father is acting like none of this surprises him." Melanie opened one of the bagel wrappers. "Your dad has been different since marrying her." That was true. Before Vanessa, my father used to call me every Sunday morning just to ask if I needed groceries or my oil changed. He remembered birthdays. He cried at movies. Now conversations with him felt strangely rehearsed, like he was always distracted by something happening just outside the room. "Do you remember my gallery opening last spring?" I asked suddenly. Melanie nodded. "Your mother was so proud that night." The memory hit me hard because it had been one of the few times in years I saw my mother genuinely glowing. I had spent almost 18 months helping redesign a historic hotel lobby downtown, and the project ended up being featured in Midwest Living magazine. At the launch party, my mother introduced me to strangers like I had hung the moon itself. "That is my daughter," she kept saying with tears in her eyes. "She notices beauty in places everybody else ignores." But Vanessa had spent most of the night whispering comments loud enough for me to hear. Interior decorating is very trendy right now, she told one couple while sipping champagne. Claire finally found something cute to do with herself. Even then, my mother noticed. Later that evening, while we stood near the dessert table under string lights, she squeezed my hand gently and said, "Never let people reduce your work to something smaller just because it intimidates them." At the time, I thought she was comforting me. Now I wonder if she had already started seeing warning signs everywhere around us. Melanie leaned forward across my kitchen island. "Call the lawyer." I looked down at the business card again. "What if this is nothing?" She gave me a long look. "Your mother does not sound like a woman who leaves cryptic instructions for fun." Before I could answer, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was my father. I hesitated before answering. "Hi, Dad." Silence for a second. Then his tired voice. "Vanessa scheduled a family dinner tomorrow night." My stomach tightened immediately. "Why?" Another pause. I could hear ice clinking softly in his glass. "She wants everybody together before discussing the estate." Everybody. That meant Ethan, Aunt Linda, probably Vanessa's brother too. Witnesses, pressure, performance. My father lowered his voice suddenly. "Claire, before tomorrow, there is something you need to understand about your mother's finances." Then the line went completely dead. I called my father back 3 times after the line disconnected, but every call went straight to voicemail. By midnight, I was sitting alone on my apartment floor with my mother's business card in one hand and my phone in the other, replaying his last sentence over and over in my head. "There is something you need to understand about your mother's finances." Not finances. Not money, my mother's finances. The wording felt deliberate somehow. Personal, careful, like he had almost said too much. The next evening, I drove to the house just before 7. The sky over Chicago was dark blue and heavy with freezing rain, and the windshield wipers made that dull, rhythmic sound that always reminds me of funerals. The house looked warm from outside. Yellow lights glowing through the windows, smoke curling from the chimney. For one strange second, it almost looked normal again. Then I walked inside and realized Vanessa had rearranged the entire dining room. My mother's chairs were gone. The old linen runner my grandmother embroidered had disappeared too. In its place sat polished white plates, gold napkin rings, and tiny candles floating in crystal bowls, like some magazine spread pretending to be intimate. Aunt Linda hugged me first. "Sweetheart, how are you holding up?" she whispered softly. Before I could answer, Vanessa appeared behind her wearing a cream cashmere sweater and diamond earrings. My father definitely could not afford 5 years ago. "Claire made it," she said brightly. "Now we can finally discuss things as a family." I noticed the stack of folders sitting beside her wine glass immediately. My stomach tightened. Ethan was already seated at the table scrolling through his phone. "Hey," he muttered without looking up. Vanessa touched his shoulder gently. "Put the phone away, honey. This is important." The whole thing felt staged, like she had rehearsed everyone's positions before I arrived. Dinner started strangely normal: roasted chicken, green beans. Expensive wine Vanessa kept refilling for everyone except me. My father barely spoke at all. Every time I looked toward him, he stared at his plate like he wanted to disappear into it. Finally, Vanessa folded her napkin carefully and smiled at the table. "I think Eleanor would want us to move forward with peace and generosity." There it was. Aunt Linda shifted uncomfortably beside me. Ethan leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. Vanessa opened one of the folders. As everyone knows, Eleanor left behind substantial liquid assets. Liquid assets, not savings, not inheritance. She made my mother sound like a corporate portfolio. "Approximately $800,000, she continued smoothly. "Claire is obviously the direct beneficiary, but we all know Eleanor cared deeply about family." I stared at her. "What exactly are you saying?" She gave me a patient smile people use on difficult children. "I am saying grief can cloud judgment. Major financial decisions should involve the people who love you." Ethan finally spoke up. "Mom thinks we should create a shared family investment account." I blinked slowly. "A what?" Vanessa slid papers across the table toward me. "Just an agreement. Ethan has an incredible business opportunity, and your father's retirement investments have suffered recently. We all sacrifice for family sometimes." My chest tightened hard. "You want me to hand over my mother's inheritance 3 days after her funeral?" Vanessa's expression changed instantly. Hurt, offended, perfectly performed. "Claire," she said softly, That money came from years your father supported Eleanor financially. It is not unreasonable to think the family should benefit together. I looked at my father. Finally, Dad? He rubbed his forehead slowly without meeting my eyes. Things have been difficult financially, he murmured. More difficult than you realize. The room suddenly felt too warm, too small. What does that mean? I asked quietly. Vanessa answered before he could. Your father made sacrifices after the divorce. Supporting two households was not easy. I almost laughed from disbelief, because my mother paid for nearly everything herself after the divorce. The studio, my tuition, even repairs on this house twice when my father's business struggled. But Vanessa kept talking calmly, steadily, layering lie over lie until even Aunt Linda started looking uncertain. Eleanor was brilliant creatively, Vanessa said with a sigh. But she was not always practical financially. That sentence hit me harder than I expected, because it rewrote my mother completely. It turned 27 years of hard work into some reckless emotional hobby. That is not true, I said immediately. Vanessa tilted her head sadly. Claire, sweetheart, your mother hid a lot from you because she wanted to protect you. Protect me. The word echoed strangely in my head. Then Vanessa slid another document toward me. This simply allows us temporary oversight while estate matters settle. I looked down at the page. Legal transfer language, shared authority, account access. My pulse started pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. You already prepared all this? I whispered. Vanessa reached for her wine glass calmly. I have been handling paperwork since the hospital. Hospital. Suddenly my father's strange behavior over the past months snapped together in my head like breaking glass. The private phone calls, the tension whenever finances came up, the way my mother kept organizing documents late at night. Slowly, I looked up from the papers and stared directly at my father. What exactly happened before Mom died? For the first time all night, he looked genuinely panicked. Vanessa answered too quickly. Claire, now is not the time for accusations. But I was no longer looking at her, because my father's hands were shaking, and in that moment, I realized something far worse than greed was hiding underneath this entire dinner. I left the dinner before dessert was served. Nobody stopped me. That was the part that hurt the most afterward. Not Vanessa's manipulation, not Ethan avoiding my eyes while pretending to study the tablecloth, not even the stack of legal papers waiting beside my plate like they had expected me to surrender quietly. It was the fact that my father let me walk out into freezing rain alone without following me once. I sat in my car gripping the steering wheel while sleet tapped against the windshield in soft, uneven clicks. My chest hurt in that strange, heavy way grief sometimes does, like your body cannot decide whether it is heartbreak or exhaustion. Around me, people moved through parking lots carrying grocery bags and coffee cups and living ordinary lives, while mine felt like it had tilted sideways overnight. At 9:14 p.m., I sent my father a text message. Dad, please just tell me the truth. 10 minutes later, he replied, we should talk privately tomorrow. That was all. No explanation, no apology, just another delay. I stared at the message so long the screen dimmed in my hand. Then my phone buzzed again. Vanessa. I almost ignored it, but something in me needed to hear how far this had gone. Claire, she said softly the second I answered, I think emotions are making this harder than it needs to be. I laughed quietly in disbelief. My mother died 6 days ago, and I understand that, she replied immediately in the careful, soothing tone people use with unstable strangers. But Eleanor would never want division inside this family. Family. She kept using that word like ownership papers. Why were legal documents already prepared? I asked. Silence flickered briefly on the line before she answered. Your father and I were only trying to simplify things for everyone. You were trying to gain access to my inheritance. Her voice cooled slightly. Claire, that money exists because your father carried financial responsibilities for years. Something snapped inside me then. That is a lie, and you know it. The silence afterward felt dangerous somehow. Then Vanessa sighed softly. You always inherited your mother's emotional side. Emotional, difficult, sensitive. It was always the same language whenever women refused to surrender politely. Good night, Vanessa, I said quietly and hung up before she could answer. The next morning I woke up to 4 new emails, all from Vanessa. The first had the subject line, Family Financial Transition. Attached were scanned documents and bullet points outlining temporary shared oversight of estate accounts. The second email sounded warmer, more personal. Claire, I know your mother's passing has been overwhelming. Your father is devastated. Please do not make this process harder on him than it already is. The third email included budget spreadsheets showing my father's retirement losses, red numbers, investment declines, loan balances. I stared at them for nearly 20 minutes before realizing something strange. Several dates overlapped with years my mother quietly expanded her business. Years she worked non-stop. Years she barely took vacations. My stomach tightened slowly. By the fourth email, Vanessa stopped pretending. Delaying these signatures could create unnecessary legal complications for everyone involved. I closed my laptop immediately after reading that one, not because I was intimidated, because suddenly I understood this was never about healing after loss. This had started long before my mother died. Around noon, Aunt Linda called me unexpectedly. Her voice sounded hesitant. "Honey, Vanessa mentioned your father may have helped support Eleanor's company privately over the years." I sat completely still. "That is not true." Linda paused awkwardly. "Well, Vanessa sounded very convincing." Convincing, that word haunted me all afternoon, because lies repeated calmly enough start sounding reasonable to people who want peace more than truth. By evening, even cousins I barely spoke to had started sending carefully worded messages. "Hope everybody works things out. Money tears families apart. Your mother would want unity." Nobody asked what actually happened. Nobody asked why I looked half dead at dinner. They just absorbed Vanessa's version because she delivered it beautifully. Controlled, polished, respectable. Meanwhile, I sat alone in my apartment wearing old sweatpants, surrounded by unopened sympathy flowers already beginning to wilt at the edges. Around 7 that night, I finally called Daniel Mercer. My hands trembled while the phone rang. Once, twice. Then a calm, older voice answered. "Daniel Mercer speaking." For a second, I could not talk. I just stared out my apartment window at traffic lights glowing red through the snow. "Claire Whitmore?" he asked gently before I even introduced myself. My heart stopped. "How did you know it was me?" A long pause followed. Then he said quietly, "Your mother asked me to expect your call eventually." Every tiny sound in my apartment suddenly disappeared. "Mr. Mercer." My voice cracked slightly. What exactly did my mother know? I heard paper shifting softly on his end of the line. Then another pause. Careful. Measured. "Claire," he said finally, "before we discuss anything further, I need to ask you one question." My stomach tightened instantly. "Okay." His voice lowered slightly. "Has Vanessa already tried to access the trust?" The room went completely silent around me, because until that exact moment, I had never heard the word trust before. For a few seconds after Daniel Mercer said the word trust, I honestly thought he had the wrong person. I stood motionless in my kitchen, staring at the snow gathering along my apartment balcony while my coffee went cold beside me. "I do not understand," I said quietly. Daniel's voice remained calm, steady, the kind of voice that made people stop panicking long enough to think clearly. "Your mother established a private, irrevocable trust approximately 8 months ago," he explained. "The fact that Vanessa is already attempting to secure account access suggests Eleanor's concerns were justified." My throat tightened painfully. Concerns about what? There was a pause long enough for me to hear papers shifting on his desk again. "That conversation is better handled in person." I closed my eyes briefly. "Did my father know?" Another silence, softer this time. "Claire," Daniel said carefully, "your mother loved your father very much once, but by the end, she trusted documentation more than promises." After we hung up, I sat alone at my kitchen table for nearly an hour without moving. Outside, the city kept going. Sirens somewhere downtown, the rumble of trains, snowplows scraping wet streets. But inside my apartment, everything felt suspended, like the world had quietly stepped backward while I was not paying attention. I kept replaying the last year in my head, trying to find the moment my mother realized she needed protection from her own family. The thought made me physically sick. Around midnight, I finally drove back to the house because I needed to see her studio again. Needed proof she had really been there. The driveway lights glowed pale against the snow when I pulled in. Most of the house was dark except for the kitchen. I walked inside quietly and found my father sitting alone at the table wearing the same gray sweater from dinner 2 nights earlier, half-empty whiskey glass beside him. reading glasses pushed low on his nose. He looked older suddenly, not elderly, just worn down in a way I had never noticed before. He looked up when I entered. "You are back late." His voice sounded rough. I set my keys down slowly. I spoke to Daniel Mercer. Every muscle in his face tightened immediately. Not surprise. Recognition. "Dad," I whispered. "What is the trust?" He stared down at the table for several long seconds before answering. "Your mother did not tell me everything." I laughed once softly because the sentence sounded almost absurd. "Apparently she did not trust you enough to." He flinched at that. Genuinely. The kitchen clock ticked loudly between us. Finally, he rubbed his eyes tiredly and said, "Things became complicated this past year." "What things?" He opened his mouth slightly, then stopped himself. "Your mother thought Vanessa was pushing too hard into financial decisions." Thought, not knew. Even now he softened the truth instinctively. "Were you having money problems?" I asked. He looked away immediately. That was answer enough. "Dad," my voice cracked slightly. "Did Mom pay your debts?" He closed his eyes then. Just for a second. But that second told me everything. My chest hollowed out completely. Because suddenly I understood why my mother worked herself into exhaustion the last 2 years. Why she stopped traveling. Why she kept taking extra projects even during chemotherapy treatments that left her barely able to stand some mornings. "How much?" I asked quietly. He swallowed hard. "It is not what you think. Then tell me what it is." But before he could answer, footsteps sounded upstairs. Vanessa. My father's entire posture changed instantly. Smaller somehow, guarded. Vanessa entered the kitchen wearing silk pajamas and a cream robe tied neatly at the waist. Her eyes moved from me to my father in one sharp glance. "Claire." Her tone was cool immediately. "It is almost 1 a.m. I stared at her. "Why did you already know about the trust?" The question landed hard enough that even my father looked startled. Vanessa recovered quickly though, too quickly. "I have no idea what you are talking about." Daniel Mercer asked, panic. Then it disappeared beneath practiced composure. "Your mother always enjoyed making things unnecessarily dramatic," she said calmly. "Claire, grief is distorting your thinking. Grief, emotional, sensitive. Always the same script." My father stood abruptly so fast his chair scraped the floor. "Enough." Both of us looked at him in shock because he almost never raised his voice anymore. He pressed shaking hands against the counter. "This entire situation has gone too far." Vanessa's eyes narrowed slightly. "Richard." "No," he said quietly. "No more tonight." Silence spread through the kitchen heavily after that. Vanessa stared at him for several long seconds before turning back toward me. "You should get some sleep, Claire." Then she walked upstairs without another word. My father looked exhausted suddenly, smaller than I had ever seen him. "Dad," I whispered, "what happened to us?" He stared toward the staircase for a long time before answering softly, "I think your mother saw the truth before I did." Then he picked up his whiskey glass and walked away, leaving me alone in the kitchen where my mother used to dance barefoot while making Sunday pancakes. I stood there listening to the house settle around me. Empty rooms, distant pipes humming softly through the walls, snow tapping lightly against the windows. For the first time since the funeral, I stopped trying to hold everything together. I sat down in my mother's old seat at the table and cried quietly into my hands while the rest of the house slept upstairs without her. And sometime around 3 a.m, after the tears finally stopped and exhaustion settled into my bones, I reached into my pocket, pulled out Daniel Mercer's business card again, and realized I was no longer afraid to find out what my mother had been trying to protect me from. I met Daniel Mercer the following morning in a quiet brick building near the Chicago River, where the lobby smelled faintly like old paper and dark coffee. His office sat on the 7th floor with tall windows overlooking frozen sidewalks crowded with people in heavy winter coats. Nothing about him matched the image I had created in my head. He was not cold or intimidating. He looked more like somebody's thoughtful grandfather than a high-powered estate attorney. Silver hair, navy sweater beneath his blazer, reading glasses hanging from a cord around his neck. When I stepped into his office, he stood immediately and said, "Claire, you have your mother's eyes." That almost broke me before we even sat down. His assistant brought tea without asking what I wanted, chamomile with honey, exactly how my mother used to make it when I was sick. Daniel noticed my expression and smiled faintly. Your mother insisted I keep proper tea in the office because she hated bad coffee and believed stress should never be handled on an empty stomach. The sentence landed softly somewhere deep in my chest. Not because it was dramatic, because it sounded exactly like her. Daniel waited until I settled into the chair before opening a thick leather folder on his desk. Your mother became my client 8 months ago, he said carefully. At first, she only wanted to reorganize business assets. Then things changed. I folded my hands tightly in my lap. Changed how? Daniel looked directly at me. She discovered your father had quietly leveraged several shared financial accounts to cover investment losses tied to Vanessa's brother's development company. I stared at him blankly for a second. What? The investments failed. His voice remained calm. Significantly. The room suddenly felt colder. My father used my mother's money? Daniel nodded once, without fully disclosing the extent of the exposure. I swallowed hard. Did Vanessa know? Your mother believed she did. Believed. Again, that careful lawyer language. But I could hear the truth underneath it. Daniel slid several papers across the desk toward me. Bank transfers, property liens, business filings. My father's signature appeared over and over, beside numbers large enough to make my stomach tighten painfully. Your mother covered portions of these losses privately during the past year, Daniel explained. That is why she continued accepting additional design contracts during treatment. Suddenly, I remembered all those late nights in her studio. The heating pad she kept pressed against her lower back while answering client emails at midnight. The way her hands trembled sometimes pouring coffee, but she kept working anyway. She was not building extra security for herself. She was quietly trying to stop the family from collapsing. I pressed my fingers against my forehead. Why did she not tell me? Daniel's expression softened slightly. Because she knew exactly how you would respond. I looked up at him. You would have protected her before protecting yourself, he said quietly. And she did not want that for you. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Snow drifted past the windows outside, while somewhere deeper in the office, somebody laughed softly near a copier machine. Normal sounds, ordinary sounds. They made the conversation feel even more unreal somehow. Finally, Daniel opened another folder entirely separate from the financial records. The trust your mother created is fully protected, he said. Irrevocable. Legally isolated from marital claims and outside access. He slid the documents toward me slowly. Everything inside belongs solely to you. I looked down expecting numbers. Instead, the first page listed my mother's design company ownership percentages, investment accounts, property rights, and intellectual licensing agreements tied to commercial projects she had completed over 20 years. My throat tightened instantly. This is not just the inheritance, Daniel nodded slightly. No, it is your mother's life's work. I stared at the pages while realization slowly settled over me. My mother had not spent 27 years quietly building a small little business the way Vanessa described it. She had built something substantial, stable, valuable. Daniel leaned back carefully in his chair. Your mother underestimated many things in life, he said softly, but she never underestimated preparation. That afternoon, after leaving Daniel's office, I did something I had not done in weeks. I went back to work. My downtown design studio smelled like dust and eucalyptus candles when I unlocked the door. Blueprints still covered my drafting table from a hotel restoration project I abandoned after the funeral. My assistant Nina looked up from her computer in shock. Claire? I gave her a tired smile. I know. I disappeared. She stood immediately. You do not have to be here. Actually, I said quietly while removing my coat. I think I do. For the next several hours, I worked silently reviewing lighting plans and vendor contracts while snow fell steadily outside the windows. Nobody treated me carefully there. Nobody spoke in soft, pitying voices. Nina only handed me coffee at one point and asked, "Do you want me to reschedule the client walkthrough Friday?" I looked down at the blueprints spread across my desk. Then I heard my mother's voice somewhere deep in memory. I like building things nobody can take away from me. No, I answered finally. Keep Friday. That evening, as city lights flickered across the river outside my office windows, my phone buzzed with another email from Vanessa. We need to finalize estate matters immediately. I stared at the message for a long moment before calmly deleting it for the first time instead of rereading every word. Then I turned back toward the hotel renderings spread across my desk and realized something strange had started happening beneath all the grief and betrayal. For the first time since my mother died, I could feel the smallest edge of strength returning. Over the next 2 weeks, I stopped waiting for my family to become honest. That was the real shift, not some dramatic speech, not revenge. Just the quiet realization that I could either drown inside their version of reality or keep building my own life the way my mother taught me to. Every morning I arrived at Whitmore Design Collective before 7:30, with coffee balanced beside blueprints and construction reports spread across the conference table. The studio occupied the top floor of an old converted printing warehouse downtown, with exposed brick walls and giant industrial windows overlooking the river. My mother helped me lease the space 4 years earlier when I left a corporate architecture firm that treated creativity like a scheduling inconvenience. Back then I was terrified. I remember standing in the empty warehouse wearing paint-stained jeans, while my mother spun slowly beneath the exposed beam, smiling like she already saw the future. "This place has good bones," she told me. "So do you." Now her words echoed every morning while I unlocked the glass front doors alone. Nina had started arriving earlier too. Sometimes she left blueberry muffins beside my drafting table without mentioning it. Sometimes she pretended not to notice when grief hit me unexpectedly in the middle of client meetings. One Thursday morning, she handed me updated renovation estimates while glancing carefully at my face. "You know," she said softly, "you are handling all of this better than most people would." I looked down at the stack of plans in my hands. "I do not feel like I am." Nina shrugged lightly. "Maybe strength does not always look dramatic." That sentence stayed with me the rest of the day. Because outwardly my life looked almost normal again. I attended vendor meetings, approved material samples, walked construction sites wearing steel-toed boots, and a long camel coat my mother bought me for my 30th birthday. But underneath everything, I felt permanently altered somehow, sharper, more aware. Like grief had removed something soft from me that would never fully return. Friday afternoon, I visited the hotel restoration project for the first time since the funeral. The building sat near Michigan Avenue, wrapped in scaffolding and winter wind. Dust floated through unfinished hallways while contractors moved equipment across concrete floors. The second I stepped inside, the project manager, Luis, looked relieved. "There she is," he called from across the lobby. "Everybody has been waiting for you. Waiting for me, not Vanessa, not my father, me." It sounds small now, but standing there with blueprints tucked beneath my arm and my company ID badge clipped against my coat, I suddenly remembered who I was outside that house. Outside the inheritance. Outside the manipulation. I was good at my work. Really good. "The lighting issue in the East Corridor," Luis said while walking beside me. "Nobody can figure out how to keep the original fixtures without violating code." I looked up toward the cracked ceiling medallions and exposed wiring overhead. "Move the emergency strips into the recessed molding channels," I answered automatically. "You preserve the architecture without compromising visibility." Luis blinked once. "That actually works." "I know," he laughed softly. "God, we missed you around here." Later that afternoon, while reviewing marble samples in the temporary site office, my phone buzzed with another text from Vanessa. "Your father is under enormous stress. I hope your recent behavior feels worth it." I stared at the message for several seconds before locking my screen without responding. Then I returned to discussing restoration materials with a supplier from Milwaukee, as if the text had never arrived. That was new too. Before, every message from her ruined my entire day. Now it just felt distant, small. By early February, more projects started coming in. A boutique restaurant renovation in River North, a private gallery redesign in Evanston. One client specifically requested me after seeing the Midwest Living feature from last year. "You understand emotional spaces," she told me during our consultation. "Most designers only think about appearances." I almost cried hearing that because it sounded exactly like something my mother would say. One evening, after everybody else left the studio, I stayed late reviewing contracts while snow drifted softly outside the windows. The office was quiet except for jazz music humming faintly from Nina's desk speakers. Around 8:30, I finally opened one of the sealed boxes I brought from my mother's studio weeks earlier. Inside were old photographs, sketches, and project binders organized in her precise handwriting. Near the bottom sat a leather portfolio I had never seen before. My name was embossed across the front in gold letters. Claire Whitmore, Principal Creative Director. My breath caught slightly. Slowly, I opened it. Inside were copies of my earliest design drafts from college, alongside handwritten notes from my mother. Strong instincts, excellent spatial balance. She notices emotional detail naturally. Tucked behind the final page was a folded note written in blue ink. One day, this company will belong to you completely. I sat frozen in my office chair staring at the handwriting while city lights reflected against the dark river below. Because for the first time since all of this began, I understood something clearly. My mother had not spent her final year preparing me to survive loss. She had been preparing me to step fully into my own life. And back at the house across the city, Vanessa still believed the inheritance was the most valuable thing my mother left behind. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning in a thick cream envelope with my father's handwriting across the front, not Vanessa's, his. That alone made my stomach tighten before I even opened it. I stood in the studio kitchen holding coffee while snow melted slowly against the windows outside. Nina glanced up from her laptop when she saw my face. "Bad?" she asked carefully. I unfolded the card slowly. "Family dinner this Friday. We need to settle everything. Please come. Love, Dad." No mention of Vanessa. No mention of lawyers. Just settle everything. Like grief and betrayal were utility bills waiting to be finalized. I read the note 3 times before setting it face down on the counter. Nina walked over quietly. "You do not have to go." I stared at the envelope for another second. "I think I do." Friday arrived gray and bitterly cold. Chicago looked frozen solid beneath low clouds and dirty snowbanks piled against sidewalks. I left work early and drove toward the house while jazz played softly through the speakers, though I barely heard any of it. At a stoplight near Lakeshore Drive, my phone buzzed through the car speakers. "Daniel Mercer." "Claire," he said after I answered. "I reviewed the latest communication Vanessa sent your father's accountant." My grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "And? She still believes the trust can be challenged emotionally, if not legally." I frowned. "What does that mean?" "Pressure," Daniel said simply. "Family narratives, guilt, isolation. She is attempting to make you feel morally obligated to surrender control voluntarily." I let out a quiet breath. That sounds exactly like her. There was a pause before Daniel spoke again. "Your mother anticipated this stage specifically." The words settled heavily in the silence between us. "What stage?" I asked quietly. "The point where appearances become more important than truth." By the time I reached the house, the windows glowed warmly against the darkening evening sky. Expensive cars lined the driveway, more people than usual. Vanessa loved witnesses. The second I stepped inside, I could smell rosemary chicken and vanilla candles. Soft jazz drifted from hidden speakers. Everything looked elegant, controlled, perfect. Aunt Linda hugged me near the entryway. "You look tired, sweetheart." "I am fine," I answered automatically, but I was tired, not physically. Emotionally tired. Tired of walking into rooms where everybody already seemed to know the version of me Vanessa had created. Ethan appeared from the dining room, carrying wine glasses. "Hey," he said awkwardly. "Mom just wants peace tonight." Peace. Another word that suddenly meant surrender in this family. Vanessa entered a moment later wearing a dark green silk blouse and a careful smile. "Claire," she said warmly enough for nearby relatives to hear, "I am so glad you came." Then she kissed the air beside my cheek without actually touching me. Performance. Always performance. The dining room looked different again. My mother's old silver serving dishes were gone. The framed watercolor she painted 20 years ago had disappeared from above the fireplace too. In its place hung some abstract gold print Vanessa probably ordered online. Tiny things. But every missing object felt deliberate now. My father stood near the bar cart refilling drinks mechanically. He looked thinner than even 2 weeks earlier. The moment our eyes met, guilt flickered across his face so quickly most people would have missed it. "Claire," he said softly, "can we talk later?" Before I could answer, Vanessa stepped beside him instantly. "After dinner," she interrupted smoothly. "Tonight is about family unity." Unity. Another word that sounded harmless until she used it. Dinner moved slowly. Painfully slowly. Silverware against plates. Ice clinking inside crystal glasses. Everybody speaking too carefully, like the room itself might crack open if anyone raised their voice too much. Vanessa controlled every conversation effortlessly. Claire's studio has been very busy lately, she told Aunt Linda while passing roasted potatoes. Work can be such a healthy distraction during grief. I looked up calmly. It is not a distraction. It is my career. Vanessa smiled lightly. Of course, but the way she said it reduced everything I built into something temporary and emotional. Across the table, my father avoided looking at either of us. Halfway through dinner, Vanessa finally folded her napkin carefully and cleared her throat. The entire room quieted instinctively. There are a few practical matters we should address together tonight, she began softly. There it was, the performance reaching its final act. She slid a leather folder onto the table. Not rushed, not aggressive, calm enough to appear reasonable. Richard and I have spent the past weeks trying to honor Eleanor's wishes while also protecting the stability of this family. I felt my pulse slow strangely instead of speeding up. Daniel had been right. This was not about legality anymore. It was about narrative. Vanessa opened the folder and removed several documents. Claire, she said gently, before misunderstandings go any further, there is something everybody here deserves to understand about your mother's financial situation. My father closed his eyes briefly. Just for a second. Vanessa continued speaking smoothly, while relatives exchanged uncertain glances around the table. Eleanor was under tremendous financial pressure before she passed, she explained. Richard protected her from much of that stress privately. Lie. Calm. Convincing lie. I watched Aunt Linda's expression shift slightly beside me. Doubt creeping in. Exactly the way Vanessa intended. In fact, Vanessa continued while sliding papers across the table, there are debts attached to several business holdings Claire may not fully understand. Debts. I almost laughed. Instead, I sat perfectly still while she carefully built her version of reality piece by piece for everyone watching. Then my father suddenly spoke for the first time all evening, quietly, barely above a whisper. Vanessa. She ignored him completely. The responsible thing would be transparency tonight. She turned toward me with practiced sympathy in her eyes. Claire, sweetheart, perhaps it is finally time you saw what your mother was hiding. And then she opened the folder completely, just as my father's face drained of all color. The room stayed completely silent after Vanessa opened the folder. Even the jazz music drifting softly from the living room seemed distant suddenly. She slid several papers across the table with slow, careful movements, like a woman preparing evidence for a jury she already believed belonged to her. These are account summaries connected to Eleanor's business liabilities, she explained calmly. Your father stepped in repeatedly to prevent serious financial consequences. Aunt Linda adjusted her glasses and leaned closer to the documents. Ethan frowned slightly while scanning the numbers. Around the table, relatives exchanged quiet, uncertain looks. Vanessa kept her voice warm and controlled. Richard never wanted Claire burdened by the details, she continued, but grief has complicated communication. I sat still watching her perform, watching the confidence in her posture, the certainty. She really believed she had already won. Finally, I reached into my bag and placed my own folder carefully beside my plate. Vanessa's eyes flickered downward immediately. What is that? She asked lightly. Transparency, I answered. My father's head lifted sharply. Vanessa gave a small laugh. Claire, this is not the time for emotional reactions. No, I said quietly. It is exactly the time. Then I opened the folder, slowly, calmly, just the way Daniel instructed me to. The first thing I placed on the table was a notarized trust summary bearing Daniel Mercer's letterhead. Then property filings, ownership documents, revenue statements from Whitmore Design Collective. Nobody spoke while the papers spread across the table one by one. Vanessa's expression changed first. Not panic yet, confusion. What exactly is this? She asked. I folded my hands carefully in front of me. The part of my mother's life you conveniently left out. My voice surprised even me. Steady, controlled. The trust you tried to access is legally protected and entirely separate from marital assets. Vanessa blinked once. Claire, my mother created it 8 months ago after discovering Dad had leveraged shared accounts to cover failed investments connected to your brother's development company. The room froze. Ethan looked sharply toward his mother. Aunt Linda lowered her wineglass slowly onto the table. My father closed his eyes briefly like somebody absorbing a physical blow. Vanessa recovered quickly, though. That is a gross misunderstanding of complex financial arrangements. No, I replied softly. It is documented. Then I slid the bank transfer records toward Aunt Linda. Mom paid portions of those debts herself while going through chemotherapy. Silence spread heavily across the room. Real silence this time. Not polite dinner silence. The kind that changes relationships permanently. Vanessa's voice sharpened slightly. Richard supported Eleanor for years after the divorce. Actually, I said calmly, the opposite happened. I reached into the folder again and placed several additional pages on the table. Tax filings, mortgage records, business transfers. My mother quietly covered major household expenses after Dad's investment losses started. Ethan stared down at the papers with visible confusion. "Mom?" he asked slowly. Vanessa ignored him completely. "Claire is grieving and being manipulated by lawyers." I almost smiled then because the sentence sounded desperate now instead of polished. "Daniel Mercer did not manipulate bank statements," I answered. My father finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Vanessa." She turned toward him immediately. "Do not do this here." But something in him had shifted too. I could see it, exhaustion finally overpowering avoidance. He looked older than I had ever seen him. "She deserves the truth," he said quietly. Vanessa stared at him in disbelief. "Richard." He swallowed hard before continuing. "Eleanor saved us financially twice last year." Aunt Linda covered her mouth softly with one hand. Ethan looked between both parents like he no longer recognized either of them. My father rubbed his forehead shakily. The investment losses were worse than I admitted. Eleanor used her business reserves to stop foreclosure proceedings on the lake property. Nobody moved. Nobody even touched their food anymore. Vanessa's entire posture tightened beside him. "You are oversimplifying complicated financial strategy," she snapped. But the polished warmth was gone now. Gone completely. "No," my father said tiredly. "I spent 2 years lying to myself." That sentence landed harder than any yelling could have, because it sounded honest. Finally honest. I looked directly at Vanessa then. "You told everyone my mother was financially unstable." My voice remained calm. Meanwhile, she was quietly protecting this entire family while dying. Vanessa opened her mouth immediately. "That is unfair." "No," I said softly. Unfair was boxing up her belongings before the funeral flowers died. The room went completely still again. Nobody defended her this time. Nobody rushed to smooth things over. Vanessa looked around the table slowly like she could not understand why control was slipping away. Then I removed the final document from my folder. A handwritten letter sealed in my mother's familiar blue stationery. My father saw the handwriting and physically stopped breathing for a second. "Daniel told me to save this until tonight," I said quietly. Vanessa's face lost color immediately. "What is that?" I looked down at the envelope in my hands. My mother's handwriting curved gently across the front. "For Claire. To be opened only if necessary." The paper trembled slightly between my fingers as I broke the seal, and when I unfolded the first page, I realized my mother had known far more than any of us ever imagined. I unfolded the letter slowly, while every person at the table watched me. My mother's handwriting looked exactly the same as it always had. Clean blue ink, slight right slant, calm even on paper. For a second, I could almost picture her sitting at the dining room table late at night, wearing her reading glasses with one hand wrapped around a mug of tea. My throat tightened before I even read the first line. "Claire, if you are reading this," then things unfolded exactly the way I feared they might. Nobody moved. Even Vanessa stayed silent now. I kept reading carefully while the room held its breath around me. "I know you will want to protect everyone. That is who you are. But protecting people who repeatedly betray your trust is not kindness. It is self-destruction." Across the table, my father lowered his head into his hands. I continued. "Your father made mistakes out of fear and weakness. Vanessa made choices out of ambition. There is a difference. But neither of them gets to rewrite the truth about our lives, simply because I am no longer here to defend it." Aunt Linda quietly wiped tears from her eyes. Ethan looked completely frozen beside his mother. I glanced toward Vanessa for one brief second. She stared at the tablecloth now instead of me. The control she carried so effortlessly for weeks had finally cracked. My hands trembled slightly as I read the next paragraph. "Everything I built was meant for you to inherit freely, not guiltily. I did not spend 27 years working nights, sacrificing my health, and rebuilding my life after divorce so my daughter would feel obligated to rescue people who never respected boundaries." Silence filled the room again. heavy silence. My father's breathing sounded uneven beside the fireplace. Then I reached the final lines. Claire, some people will call you cold the moment you stop allowing them to use you. Let them. You are not responsible for carrying the emotional weight of an entire family simply because you are capable of it. I folded the letter carefully after that. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then finally my father whispered, "She knew." It was not really a question, more like grief arriving all over again in a different form. Vanessa straightened slightly beside him. "Eleanor always exaggerated emotional situations," she said weakly, but even she no longer sounded convinced by her own words. I looked at her calmly. "No," she prepared for them. My father rubbed both hands over his face slowly. "I never meant for any of this to happen." His voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. "I thought I could fix things before Eleanor found out how bad the investments became." "She did find out," I answered quietly, "and she protected everybody anyway." That seemed to hurt him more than anger would have. Ethan finally spoke for the first time in almost 20 minutes. "Mom, did you really try to access the trust before the funeral?" Vanessa turned toward him immediately. "I was trying to stabilize this family." "By lying to everybody?" he asked. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out immediately. That silence answered enough. Aunt Linda pushed her untouched dinner plate away softly. "Vanessa," she said carefully, "why did you tell us Eleanor was financially irresponsible?" Vanessa looked cornered now. Not dramatic, just exposed. "Because Richard was overwhelmed," she snapped quietly. "Because somebody needed to manage reality while Eleanor buried herself in work and sentimentality." I almost laughed at the word sentimentality, because my mother's so-called sentimentality had literally saved this family from collapse. My father looked at Vanessa slowly then, really looked at her, maybe for the first time in years. "She was dying," he whispered. Vanessa's expression hardened defensively, and she was hiding assets from her own husband. "Because she stopped trusting us," he answered. The us in that sentence hung painfully in the air. I stood slowly from my chair then, not dramatically, calmly. My mother's letter still rested warm in my hand. "I am not signing anything," I said quietly. "I am not surrendering my mother's work, and I am not continuing conversations built on manipulation." Vanessa looked up sharply. "Claire, after everything your father is facing financially, you would really walk away?" I met her eyes evenly. "No, I am walking out of a situation you created." Then I turned toward my father. That part hurt the most, because underneath everything, he was still my father. Still, the man who taught me how to ride a bike in empty church parking lots and brought me strawberry ice cream during snowstorms. "Dad," I said softly, "I love you, but I cannot keep protecting people from the consequences of their own choices." His eyes filled immediately. "Claire." I shook my head gently before he could continue. "Mom spent her final year trying to save everybody quietly. I am not going to spend mine doing the same thing." Nobody stopped me when I picked up my coat. Nobody argued. The house felt strangely hollow now, like truth had removed whatever performance used to hold it together. As I reached the front hallway, my father's voice stopped me softly from behind. "She was proud of you, you know." I closed my eyes briefly. "I know." Then I stepped outside into the freezing night air while snow drifted slowly beneath the porch lights. My chest still hurt. Grief still sat heavy inside me. None of that magically disappeared because the truth finally surfaced. But for the first time since my mother died, I no longer felt trapped inside someone else's version of reality. And somewhere behind me inside that house, I could feel the family I once knew quietly breaking apart. 6 months later, spring finally returned to Chicago. The snow melted from sidewalks. Cafes rolled small tables back onto the streets. The river stopped looking gray and exhausted all the time. And somehow, little by little, I stopped feeling that way too. Life did not magically become perfect after that dinner. Families do not heal in one dramatic conversation. Sometimes they do not heal at all. My father and I spoke only occasionally at first, short phone calls, careful conversations about practical things. He moved out of the house 3 months after everything came apart. Not because of one explosive fight, but because silence eventually becomes unbearable when truth finally enters a room. Vanessa disappeared quietly after that. No dramatic ending, no public downfall, just distance. Lawyers handled the remaining financial issues. Documents were signed, accounts separated. Reality settled where performance used to live. Ethan called me once in early March. "I did not know," he said quietly over the phone, "about any of it." I believed him. "I know," I answered. There was a long silence before he spoke again. "Your mom was kinder to me than she needed to be." That almost made me cry because it was true. My mother had loved people even when they disappointed her, especially then. Some mornings I still wake up missing her so sharply it feels physical. Grief does not disappear once the truth comes out. It just changes shape. But the difference now is that I no longer confuse grief with guilt. That took me a long time to understand. I spent years believing love meant carrying everyone else's pain quietly so they could stay comfortable. My mother did that too. And in some ways it broke her heart long before illness ever touched her body. That is probably the deepest lesson this entire experience gave me. Boundaries are not cruelty. Protecting yourself is not selfish. And allowing people unlimited access to your kindness does not guarantee they will value it. Sometimes it only teaches them how much they can take before you finally collapse. Whitmore Design Collective grew faster that spring than I expected. We expanded into the empty office next door. Nina became full-time project director. The hotel restoration project won a regional preservation award in April. During the ceremony, somebody asked where I learned to design spaces that felt emotionally alive. I smiled for a second before answering, "From my mother." And for once, saying her name out loud did not hurt quite as much. A few weeks later, I reopened my mother's old studio, not as a private office, as a community creative space for women rebuilding their lives after loss, divorce, illness, or financial hardship. Nothing extravagant, warm lighting, long wooden tables, shelves filled with donated art supplies, a small kitchen in the back with tea, coffee, and cinnamon cookies, because my mother believed people tell the truth more easily when they feel safe. On opening day, I stood quietly near the windows, while sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors she once walked across every night. Women laughed softly around the tables. Somebody played Ella Fitzgerald through an old speaker near the bookshelves, and for the first time since the funeral, the room felt alive again instead of haunted. Before leaving that evening, I noticed one empty chair near the back corner of the studio. My mother's chair, the same one Vanessa removed from the kitchen the night everything started unraveling. I had restored the wood myself, sanded every scratch carefully, reupholstered the seat in soft gray fabric almost identical to the original. I walked over and ran my fingers gently across the backrest while the last golden light of sunset filled the room around me. Then I sat down quietly in the chair and looked around at the life continuing inside that space. Not perfect, not untouched by pain, but honest, peaceful, real. I think that is what healing actually looks like, not becoming unbreakable. Not pretending betrayal did not wound you deeply. Just learning that your identity does not have to remain trapped inside what hurt you. If somebody listening to my story right now feels invisible inside their own family, or manipulated into believing your kindness should cost you your dignity, I need you to hear this carefully. Your instincts matter. The small, uneasy feeling in your chest matters. The exhaustion you feel from constantly protecting other people's comfort matters. God, or the universe, or whatever quiet force carries people through dark seasons, gave you intuition for a reason. Do not ignore it just because somebody else calls you difficult for finally noticing the truth. Protect your finances. Protect your peace. Protect your sense of self before resentment quietly replaces love. And please remember this too. Some people will only respect boundaries after they lose access to you completely. That loss belongs to them, not you. My name is Claire Whitmore. I am 32 years old, and the core lesson I want to leave with you is this. Never abandon yourself just to keep other people comfortable. Thank you for sitting with me through this story. Truly. There are nights when pain convinces people they are alone in what they survived, and maybe hearing someone else speak honestly about betrayal, grief, family, and healing makes the silence feel a little less heavy tonight. If this story stayed with you in some way, I would love to hear where you are listening from and what part touched your heart the most. And if you want more stories about quiet strength, complicated families, hidden truths, and rebuilding life after heartbreak, there are more waiting for you in the next videos in this playlist. Some of those stories begin with pain too, but not all endings stay broken forever.